Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode number 20 of History for Shut-ins. Can't believe we've made it to our 20th episode. Today, we are going to discuss the presidencies of Martin Van Buren, of William Henry Harrison, and of John Tyler. A common theme through each is the annexation of Texas, moving westward, manifest destiny, and the expansion of slavery. So with regards to Van Buren, last class on Friday, we discussed his domestic policy and how a depression really hampered his ability to legislate. From a foreign policy perspective, he faced a diplomatic crisis with Great Britain. It seems about every decade from the founding through this period, there's some sort of crisis with Great Britain. It grew out of tension between the United States, Canada, and British soldiers along the borders between New York and Canada and Maine and Canada. Problems began when a very small separatist movement in Canada sought to gain independence from the British in late 1837. When they were unsuccessful, dissidents retreated to the United States, recruited citizens of America to their cause, and took refuge on an island in the Niagara River, which divides America, specifically New York, from Canada. Some Americans began selling guns and supplies to Canadian separatists. In response, the British ordered loyalist Canadian forces to attack the ship being used to supply the rebels. Loyalist Canadians boarded the ship by name of the Caroline, set it on fire, and pushed it over Niagara Falls, killing one American. Sentiment grew in the United States to declare war on Great Britain. A British ship was burned as a retaliatory act. Van Buren looked to avoid a major diplomatic issue with the British, and he rejected the possibility of an aggressive response. Instead, he sent General Winfield Scott to the region to impress upon American citizens the need for a peaceful resolution and to make it clear that the United States government would not attack the British. Early in January of 1838, Van Buren proclaimed American neutrality with regards to Canadian independence, a declaration which Congress endorsed by passing a neutrality law designed to discourage participation of American citizens in foreign conflicts. Each of these actions helped to lower the temperature. A new crisis surfaced in late 1838 along the border between Maine and Canada, where America began settling on lands claimed by both the United States and Great Britain. When the British troops forcibly removed some of the settlers and threw others in prison, tensions between Great Britain and the governor of Maine, whose name was John Fairfield, grew. Fairfield called on Martin Van Buren to send troops to the area. To settle the Maine crisis, Van Buren met with the British minister to the United States. Van Buren also sent General Winfield Scott to Maine with orders basically to rein in Governor Fairfield and others who were helping to, heighten the temperature on this. Van Buren's tactics worked. The diplomatic negotiations begun by Van Buren resulted with the signing of what is called the Webster-Ashburton Treaty in 1842 between the United States and Great Britain, and it resolved the border crisis. Van Buren's diplomacy, which of course can take patience, decreased tensions between the United States and Great Britain, kept America out of a war with Great Britain. His pursuit of negotiations and accommodation in the face of the loss of American lands and property and lives angered many in Maine and New York who wanted him to take a tougher stance. The criticism that Van Buren took in both cases was considerable. When Van Buren lost his 1840 bid for re-election, he never considered it the end of his political career. Over the next 4 years, he emerged as the favorite for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1844. Having lost the 1840 presidency, or presidential election, many Democrats saw him as a weak candidate. Those Democrats supported the annexation of Texas. You see the flag behind me. Let me stand up. This is the Texas flag. So, many Democrats supported the annexation of Texas during the early 1840s. There were party members who opposed the admittance of another slave state to the Union. So this issue is going on and on. Western expansion, slavery, upsetting basically the balance. There are an equal number of slave states and free states at this time. So bringing in another slave state upsets that balance. Looking to secure his status as the favorite for the Democratic nomination, Van Buren tried to bridge the divide in his party by stating in the spring of 1844 that while he did not support the immediate annexation of Texas, he welcomed it at some future date. This was a political miscalculation, to say the least. The pro-annexation wing of the Democratic Party was strong. Some Democrats threatened to bolt the party if Van Buren won the nomination. Some of his longtime allies actually left him because of this issue. The final blow came when Andrew Jackson proclaimed that he was in favor of immediate annexation and suggested that Van Buren, who was his vice president in his second term, step aside. So that is a true blow to Van Buren. At the 1844 Democratic National Convention in Baltimore, support for Van Buren's candidacy weakened. Democrats turned to James K. Polk of Tennessee, who was, of course, pro-annexation. Polk also had Andrew Jackson's support. Although he is disappointed, Van Buren supports Polk's candidacy as a good soldier. He helps carry Polk to victory over Whig candidate Henry Clay in 1844. The closing of party ranks did not exactly smooth over the relations between Polk and Van Buren. Van Buren and his allies believed that Polk owed his election largely to Van Buren's efforts and expected Van Buren to receive an important post in the Polk administration. This did not occur, although Polk offered Van Buren the minister position to Great Britain, an appointment that Van Buren actually refused. Relations between Van Buren and Polk and their wings of the party actually deteriorated. In 1848, the question of new states and slavery became more divisive. Van Buren headed a splinter group known as the Free Soil Party, comprised of dissatisfied Democrats, Whigs who opposed their party's nominee, General Zachary Taylor, and members of the anti-slavery Liberty Party. So we're at a point in American history where it seems that there are new parties popping up left and right. It's not until Abraham Lincoln becomes president, and we're still 20 years out from that, when the Republican Party is truly ensconced, if you will. So, Free Soil Party's main issue was the opposition to the growth of slavery in Western territories. Taylor ends up winning convincingly, although Free Soilers ran well in New York, Massachusetts, Ohio, and Illinois. The 1848 election marked the end of Van Buren's active political career. He wrote his memoirs in 1850, in the early 1850s, as well as a study of the formation of American political parties for which he played such a huge role. Van Buren lives to see the coming of the Civil War, and he supports Lincoln's decision to resist secession with force. Van Buren dies in 1862, just after the war had begun. The 1830s, which are Van Buren's political heyday, were filled with significant change that impacted American political party systems and the electoral process. 4 times more in the electorate during the 1828 and 1832 presidential campaigns was equaled in the 2 elections in which Van Buren was the presidential candidate. Election results from 1836 and 1840 showed growth in both the number of voters and the percentage of eligible voters who actually voted, even though suffrage was still limited to white males. For those watching, let me know if there's an issue with the video. I'm having a kind of choppy reception here. Hopefully you can hear me and see me well. One major factor for the growth was in the development of the Whig Party. In 1836, Whigs mobilized voters along regional lines. Although they did not defeat Van Buren, the anti-Democrat opposition grew its voting strength by 200,000 from the 1832 election. In 1840, the Whigs almost doubled their total in defeating Van Buren. Democrats continued to expand their power. Even in Van Buren's defeat in 1840, he received almost double the number of votes that Jackson did in winning re-election in 1832. So it shows you how the electorate has grown. The huge increase in the electorate can be attributed to 3 reasons. One, the institutional reforms that the period of Andrew Jackson continued to take hold at state and county levels. These changes made it easy for white males to vote who were over the age of 21, even if they were not citizens, residents, or property owners. The second development was the growth of party organizations at the county level controlled by local political bosses meant that eligible men would be mobilized, to the polls on election day by precinct workers. The third factor was the institutionalization of the 2-party competition between Whigs and Democrats, which gave workers in each party an incentive to get the maximum number of voters to the polls on election day. The development marked America's entrance into a period of intense 2-party competition for political office in most parts of the country. The electorate responded with voting percentages anywhere from 60 to 75%, where they would remain throughout most of the 19th century. I think now if we get roughly 50%, that's a good turnout. Slavery continues to be an issue. Abolitionism continues to grow during the second half of the 1830s, with the American Anti-Slavery Society claiming more than 250,000 members by 1840. Abolitionists remained outside American political and social mainstream. They're seen as being too activist, too liberal, too progressive. In 1837, Reverend Elijah Parrish Lovejoy, who was editor of the Alton Observer, an anti-slavery newspaper, began printing anti-slavery editorials in his newspaper in Illinois. A drunken posse of pro-slavery whites cornered him in his newspaper office, killed him, and dumped his press into the Mississippi River and set fire to the building. Abolitionists had their martyr to freedom of the press, and the movement grew. But their continued marginalization and violent response that was provoked among whites revealed the tough prospects that abolitionists face. The slumping economy did not discourage immigrants from coming to the country. By the end of Van Buren's administration, 80,000 a year were entering America, which was the start of a wave that brought more than 4 million to America between 1840 and 1860. Where are most of those immigrants going? To the north, where they're needed in manufacturing. The 1840 census, American total population was more than 17 million. Many immigrants were Irish Catholic, about 44%, or German, 30%. So 3/4 right there of the immigrants. They settled largely in the Northeast and Midwest, often in major cities, where the majority worked in low-paying manual labor jobs. A number of recent immigrants moved into skilled or semi-skilled jobs. Of course, new immigrants aren't always welcome. In New York City, immigrants clashed with Protestant workers who saw the newcomers as a threat for their jobs, as adherents to an alien religious faith, Catholicism, right? Irish and German Catholics. And they also saw the new immigrants as inferior socially and culturally. American nativism emerged as a potent force in politics in the late 1830s. Most immigrants joined the Democratic Party. Mobs of Democratic Irishmen fought mobs of Whigs for control of the streets and polls in city elections in major cities throughout the Northeast and Midwest. New immigrants would also be clashing with free blacks in the North. Both competed for scarce jobs and low wages as the economic depression grew. Immigrants were desperate to climb the American social, economic, and political ladder. They took great pains to demonstrate that they were superior to the free blacks, who often lived in their neighborhoods and worked in similar jobs. Immigrants were one of the most determined opponents of abolitionism. Why? Because if slaves are freed, slaves would then take the jobs of new immigrants because freed slaves would work at lower rates. That was the fear. America became increasingly active in other social movements besides abolitionism during Van Buren's administration. Reform-minded citizens began to take stands on temperance, free public education, penitentiaries, and women's rights. The Reform impulse sprung largely from a desire to improve American society, and especially in the wake of the Depression, in the wake of explosive and disruptive growth of America's market economy, political democracy, the growth of cities, and of course, the growth in immigration. A notable facet of mid-19th century social movements was the prominent role played by women. Despite being denied the right to vote, women activists formed organizations and, became public advocates of reform movements. The social movements had mixed success. The movement for women's rights floundered even as women played a more prominent role in public discussions. Temperance advocates ran into stiff opposition from immigrants, for whom alcohol served an important social and cultural function, as well as from supporters in the Democratic Party. Free public education grew in the 1830s, especially in the North. The American penal system was altered to emphasize the possibility of actually reforming prisoners. Van Buren's administration completed removal of Native American tribes in the Northwest to west of the Mississippi. Van Buren ordered, once again, General Winfield Scott in 1838 to round up Cherokees of Georgia and force them to migrate along the Trail of Tears to the Indian territories west of the Mississippi. Along the way, as we discussed earlier, about 25% of them died. Seminoles in Florida were forced to relocate to the west. Between the tribe and the federal government ended by 1842. By the close of Van Buren's term, all eastern tribes had ended their resistance to white land grabbing and been resettled in reservations in the Wisconsin and Iowa territories. Then west of the Mississippi River, and Arkansas, and west of the Red River on the Texas border. Van Buren's problem is he's president between Jackson and Lincoln, and it's not just his problem. There are several others that we're going to discuss. He is one of the most important politicians in American history. He entered politics in the early 1800s and joined the Democratic Republicans, the party of Thomas Jefferson. He rose to prominence at a time when his party was really under the weight of factionalism, infighting, a lack of organization, and disunity ideologically. Van Buren recognized these weaknesses and rectified them by constructing a cohesive and unified political organization, both in his home state of New York and nationally. He believed that political conflict among allies and between opponents was unavoidable. The skill was in managing conflict. The importance of the Democratic Party, which is really seen as his crowning achievement, was that Van Buren hoped he could control intra-party conflict in order to defeat its opponents. Critics of Van Buren focused on his role in party building and charged his efforts were the work of a cynical, manipulative, and power-hungry politician. He wanted to build an effective and efficient political organization because he thought it was the best mechanism for defending and growing the Jackson and Jefferson ideals, the preeminence of state and local concerns rather than federal, decreasing power of the federal government, and the importance of protecting America from government or public institutions that supposedly threaten their liberty. The main challenge Van Buren faced was the economic depression, which we talked about. His chief response, which was a proposal for an independent treasury system, reflected Jeffersonian and Jacksonian ideals. Ironically, Van Buren, the great political leader and party builder and advocate of democratic unity, lacked the political strength to win quick congressional endorsement of the independent Treasury. Congress approved it late in 1840 after the Depression continued, largely interrupted for 3 years. Next, we will talk about William Henry Harrison, who was not in office very long. He served the shortest term of any president in American history, 32 days. He is the first Whig president, known as Old Tip, as commanding general of American forces who defeated Native Americans at the Battle of Tippecanoe in the Ohio River Valley in 1811. The Whig Party saw opportunities for advancing a candidate in the 1840 election. Well before the campaign, they knew that William Henry Harrison gave voters a strong contrast with very boring, drab, aristocratic Van Buren. They held their convention in late 1839, months before the usual time. Neither of their leaders, Daniel Webster or Henry Clay, enjoyed broad popular support. Harrison, who was a born Southerner and a war hero, seemed to make a perfect foil for Van Buren, who was from New York. Both Harrison and his running mate, John Tyler, were from Virginia, the core state of the Democratic Party. Jefferson, Monroe, Madison, on and on and on. While Clay led at first, he fell short of the nomination. Whig delegates then turned to Harrison. Both Van Buren and the Democrats made serious errors in their re-election campaign. Van Buren underestimated the power of the Whigs by assuming that they were united only by their hatred of Andrew Jackson. To the Democrats' surprise, Whigs organized and attacked Van Buren for being uncaring about America, pointing primarily at the Depression. Whigs jumped at Democrat-drawn contrasts with Van Buren. They flooded the electorate with trinkets, extolling the virtues of their down-home log cabin and hard cider candidate, the hero of Tippecanoe. Harrison was from an established Virginia family. He was a student of the classics and lived luxuriously, but he's being sold as a down-home candidate, which is interesting. Voters wanted to identify with a war hero who shared their down-to-earth values. It was the first true use of political handling of a candidate in a presidential race. While Van Buren tried to run an issues-driven campaign, Harrison stuck to emotion. During the campaign, political cartoons poked fun at Van Buren's ill-fated attempts to follow in Jackson's footsteps, as well as Van Buren's inability to effectively deal with America's economic problems. When all the ballots had been counted, Harrison won almost 4 times the electoral votes as Van Buren. Van Buren won 7 states to Harrison 19. At 68 years old, Harrison was the oldest president elected in the century. It's possible that he was already sick when he was elected. While he's addressing supporters before leaving for the White House, he said he probably would not see any of them again. His wife expressed similar feelings. She was 65 and her health was poor. Harrison gave the longest inaugural address in history, more than 2 hours. He deliberately avoided taking firm stands on issues during the campaign, earning the nickname General Mum, M-U-M, from the opposition. He presented a detailed critique of the Constitution and how he would tread lightly on what he saw as its flaws. He criticized what he perceived to be a trend towards an excess of power seized by the executive branch and pledged, quote, under no circumstances will I consent to serve a second term, unquote. Past presidential excesses in fiscal management were roundly condemned. A clear swipe at Jackson by Harrison. Harrison pledged no presidential interference in development of financial policy by Congress. He said that the veto power should only be exercised if a president believed a law passed by Congress was unconstitutional. Another shot at Jackson, remember, who had 12 vetoes. All in all, Harrison pledged himself to be pretty much a weak president operating under the direction of Congress, and this followed Whig principles. Slavery had become a hotly debated issue, and it had been debated for decades. But as the United States is growing and new states and territories are coming in to the country, the concern is, will slavery be upheld in these new territories? A slave owner himself, Harrison supported the right of states to make their own decisions in the matter. With regards to slavery, he said, quote, the lines separating powers exercised by the citizens of one state from those of another seem to be so distinctly drawn as to leave no room for misunderstanding. The attempt of those of one state to control the domestic institutions of another can only result in feelings of distrust and jealousy, certain harbingers of disunion, violence, and civil war, and the ultimate destruction of our free institutions, unquote. So, lengthy quote, but Harrison is basically saying what's going to happen. He's talking about the Civil War and secession. He saw anti-slavery elements as endangering states' rights. During the inaugural address, Harrison wore no coat or hat. When he followed afterwards, after his inauguration, his address, he went to various receptions in wet clothing. He gets pneumonia. Doctors were called in, but what they did medically actually made Harrison sicker and weakened him. 3 weeks after taking office, he is clearly dying. Exactly 1 month after taking the oath of office, Harrison was dead. The 1840 election solidified many of the factors Jackson introduced into the electoral equation. Politics as entertainment, believe it or not, increasing political power of the West, and increasing access of the vote to lower classes. No candidate before or since has been marketed to the electorate quite like Harrison. Very deceptively, quite frankly. Some could argue, though. Whigs positively inundated the populace with cheap, colorful memorabilia for the log cabin and hard cider candidate. The public embraced the image of the rugged Westerner, much like they would with Lincoln and Grant and Reagan, Teddy Roosevelt to a degree. Voter turnout surpassed 80%, up 20% from the election of 1836. Development of two strong and competitive parties, organized by urban machines and county rings to bring voters to the polls, accounted for the development of a mass democracy in the 1830s and 40s. Harrison's election marked the first time Democrats had been defeated, institutionalizing party turnover in the second U.S. party system. The first party system, remember, was the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans during the time of Washington and Adams and Jefferson. Let's talk about John Tyler. He was the vice president when Harrison died. Tyler was born after the Revolution in 1790 to an old family from Virginia's ruling class. He graduated from the College of William and Mary at the age of 17, studied law, and went to work for a prestigious law firm in Richmond. At the age of 21, he used his father's contacts to gain a seat in the Virginia House of Delegates, where he began fighting the Bank of the United States, which he opposed as an expansion of federal power. After serving uneventfully in the military during the War of 1812, he won election to the House of Representatives and quickly became a D.C. insider. As a Southern planter, Tyler bitterly opposed a strong standing army, tariffs, and increasing the vote to men without property, resenting this challenge to traditional Southern power. Jackson represented everything in politics that Tyler hated, especially the new voting power of the West. When Jackson's government attempted to restrict slavery in new states west of Missouri, Tyler saw it as such an abuse of power that he resigned from Congress in disgust. When Tyler returned to Washington, D.C. in 1827, he reluctantly supported Jackson's re-election in 1832, but became furious with Jackson during the nullification crisis. Twice he condemned Jackson on the Senate floor for what he considered Jackson's abuse of executive power. Disgusted with Jackson, Tyler, Henry Clay, and Daniel Webster formed the Whig Party. Van Buren's failure to take care of the economic depression that followed Jackson's presidency gave Whigs the chance they needed in 1840. As we said, Harrison chose Tyler as his running mate, and he did so to appeal to the South. Their slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Harrison and Tyler won the election. Ironically, Tyler was propelled into office by the commoners he had formerly tried so hard to lock out. Tyler returned to his Virginia plantation after Harrison's inaugural, but he was rushed back to Washington, D.C. once Harrison died. As no president had died in office before, some felt Tyler was an acting or interim president. Tyler importantly asserted that the Constitution gave him full and unqualified powers of the office. He had himself sworn in immediately as president, setting a critical precedent for an orderly transfer of power after the deaths of a president, such as Zachary Taylor, Abraham Lincoln, William McKinley, FDR, and JFK. Fearing he would alienate Harrison's supporters, Tyler decided to keep Harrison's entire cabinet, even though several members of that cabinet were openly hostile to Tyler and resented his assumption of office. So that's a mistake of Tyler. In a bid for re-election, Tyler works to annex Texas against wishes of abolitionists who feared that it would become another slave state. Tyler's Democratic rival, James K. Polk, blunted the issue by also endorsing Texas statehood. Tyler introduced Texas annexation to Congress as a joint resolution requiring only a majority vote of each member of Chamber of Congress, dodging the two-thirds majority required to ratify a treaty. The 1844 presidential election boiled down to a fight between Tyler, Polk, and Henry Clay. Fearing that he and Polk might split the vote, handing the election to Clay, Tyler voluntarily withdrew, consoling himself that Clay would not win. In a final result, Congress overrode his veto of a military appropriation, marking the first override of a presidential veto in American history. Nearly bankrupt, Tyler moved back to his Virginia plantation with him chaired the Richmond Convention, which attempted to reconcile the North and South. When Lincoln rejected, oh, folks, it looks like I want to thank you for joining. We're just about finished anyway. If you can hear me, just prior to the Civil War, Tyler chaired the Richmond Convention, which attempted to reconcile the North and South. When Lincoln rejected his compromises, Tyler became a leading proponent of Southern secession. I apologize for the video difficulty. Thank you for joining. We will see you tomorrow at 5 o'clock.